So we can finally start. So my talk is entitled From Self-Organization to Goal-Directedness, Origins of Autopoiesis and Minimal Cognition. So what I'm going to do is I will tell you a little bit about an ongoing research project here at the Transdisciplinary Center Leo Apostel at the Free University of Brussels, or VUB. And that is something that a group of people here are busy with. And next to myself, the person who is actually most active in that is Thomas Verlos, together with a couple of others, such as Eva Busseniers. So originally, this program started about 5 years ago, and we were funded by the John Templeton Foundation. They have a special program called the Science of Purpose. And the idea of that program was to develop a serious hard science of goal-directed systems. And so what we particularly wanted to do was to develop a very general model of how something could emerge that is goal-directed. So this is a very general abstract model. That means it doesn't go into any specific details like which specific molecules or which specific cells or which specific physical mechanisms are involved. It's at a very high level where we're just looking at networks of processes. The advantage of that abstraction is that you can represent these ideas pretty neatly in mathematical language, and then, of course, transform your mathematical model into a simulation model. So this is the kind of work that I personally am not that much involved in. If you want to have the details, it's better to look at the papers of my colleague Thomas Verlos. If you search for Thomas Verlos and chemical organization theory or reaction networks, you will find most of our stuff. So the basis of my philosophy, and that is very general, not just for this particular project, is that I'm interested in self-organization. Self-organization is commonly defined in science as global order emerging out of local interactions. And that emergence is a spontaneous process. That means you don't need some kind of an external agent to tell the system how it should organize itself. So the own dynamics of the system should be enough to get some complex organization emerge. And now the most interesting thing that you would like to see emerge is a living system. So in a sense, the question we are asking is a question about the origin of life, but at what I might call a higher level of abstraction, where, as I said, we are not looking at particular molecules or particular types of bacteria or so. We want to have an understanding of life that is abstract enough that it could, in principle, apply to life in different planets, artificial life, maybe. We have even been considering the possibility that inside a star there might be life. So we want a definition of a living system that's as broad as possible. Now, I don't know about the audience whether you have heard about the concept of autopoiesis, but I think autopoiesis is about the best definition of what is life. It dates from 1971, done by the Chilean biologist Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. So they define life as a particular closed network of processes that they call organizationally closed. And that means it is goal-directed in the sense that the implicit goal of a living system is to continue living. That means it wants to keep itself alive. What Maturana and Varela also have done is to connect this concept of autopoiesis, so that means the self-production of life, to cognition, in the sense that they argue that to keep yourself alive, you should be able to know, you need to know how to deal with all kinds of problems that may occur that might kill you. So the theory of autopoiesis has been very influential in cybernetics and the related domains, but it is a difficult, confusing theory. And to show that, I will just quickly read you, I will not go into detail, the original definition of autopoiesis. An autopoietic system is organized, defined as a unity, as a network of processes of production, transformation and destruction of components that produces the components which first, through their interactions and transformations, we generate and realize a network of processes, relations that produce them, and to constitute it, the machine, as a concrete unity in the space in which they exist by specifying the topological domain of its realization as such a network. So this is the foundational definition that everybody cites. It's not at all clear what that means. So first thing I have done is let's reformulate it more simply. So an autopoietic system first is a network of processes. What do these processes do? They produce, consume, and transform the components of the systems. And these components of the systems, they interact the one with the other so as to generate, again, the same processes that produce them. So if you want to put it even simpler, the processes produce the components and the components produce the processes. So it's a kind of a cyclical, self-referential organization. Now, implicit in the definition is what I call a process ontology. That means the essence of this whole system is processes, not objects, not static things. It's not so much the components that are important, but the processes, because it's the processes that produce the components which produce the processes, so everything is being processed. In this view, a system can be seen as a stabilized network of processes. And that's, I might say, that's the big innovation of the theory of autopoiesis. We will see a system not as some kind of a static thing, but as a network of processes, but that is sufficiently stabilized so that we can recognize it as, for example, a living cell or a living organism. Now, what I will try to do here, or at least give you a first inkling, is to formalize this notion with a particular formalism called a reaction network. Let's say, what is a reaction network? A reaction network is a set of reactions. Reactions consist of components, which I will call A, B, C, D, etc. And these components, they can be almost anything. Typically, when you're thinking about chemistry, the components could be molecules. When we're thinking about physics, the components could be particles. When we're thinking about biology, they could be cells or they could be species. But we can go even up to the level of society and technology and look at organizations, firms, people, all as components. Now, a reaction is something that transforms components. The simplest possible reaction is a component is formed, and I put that with an arrow on the left. We see arrow A appears, A is formed. If I put the arrow on the other side of the A, I represent the simple possible reaction of A disappearing. Something leaves the system, something goes out of the system. Then, of course, a more typical process is some component A is transformed into some other component. Now, we know in chemistry, usually things do not change neatly from the one into the other. You typically need a reaction. It means you need more than one component. A and B together will react and form some new components, for example, C and D. Now, what this formalism also allows is that sometimes you have components that participate in a reaction, but that are not transformed by the reaction. I have put it in the last line, A plus X gives B plus X. That is what in chemistry we would call a catalyst. X is necessary for the reaction to take place, but X itself is not transformed by the reaction. So that is the basic language of reaction networks. And now I come to a very interesting paradigm. It's a paradigm that was not developed by our group. It was developed by a group in Germany, by Peter Dittrich in particular. But one member of our group, Thomas Wellers, studied with Peter Dittrich, and so he introduced this theory in our group. And we all think it is a particularly powerful theory because it's so simple. It can do a lot of things with very simple assumption. So it defines a chemical organization. Now, I don't really like the term chemical organization precisely because, as I say, these reactions are not limited to chemicals. They can be anything. So an organization is a set of components together with the reactions that take place between these components that has two properties. First, what is defined as being closed. Closed means that when the reactions work on the components, no new components are produced. That means you can transform components into other components, but you will not generate any more components that were not already in the initial collection. And the second one, and that is the more tricky one, the network of reactions should be self-maintaining. That means there will be processes that consume components. For example, A is turned into B, but to be self-maintaining, there must be some other reaction that again produces the A that was consumed. So all consumed components are eventually produced again, which means that an organization is a collection of components that produces itself constantly. It is constantly changing, it's transforming components into other components, but in the end, all the components that were consumed are produced again, so the whole system keeps itself alive. So this was originally introduced by Peter Dietrich as a kind of a generalization of autopoiesis. It's easier to define, it's easier to model, it's easier to simulate, but it keeps the essence of this kind of a self-producing system. So let's take the simplest possible autopoietic system in this formalism. You need to have some input because we don't, thermodynamics requires that there must be some input of material for any system to maintain. So there must be some input. So some A is added to the system. A transforms into B. Some of the B leaves the system because, again, thermodynamics says that there will be some waste, there will be some dissipation of entropy, and B is transformed back into A. So it's a kind of a cycle with an input and an output. That's the simplest possible autopoiesis. It's, of course, trivial. So let's look at a little bit more complex example of one of these so-called chemical organizations. That means a collection of components and reactions that is self-maintaining. So we again have an input. A is added to the system. We have an output, some waste is produced, but in between everything else is regenerating itself. There is, for example, a reaction R1 that says that whenever there is a G, the G falls apart into a C and a B. There is a reaction R2 which says that whenever you have a C, that C falls apart into F, G, and E. There is a reaction R3, etc. So each of these reactions says that some combination of components is transformed into some other combination of components, but I have here drawn it, which is not trivial to draw these kind of things. It's still a relatively simple system, but on the drawing you see that the different reactions, the arrows, they close in on themselves. There is just this one input, the A, there's just this one output, the E, but all the others are recycled. Whenever there is an F produced, let's say, by R2, the F will then be consumed by R3, turned into a B, which then is turned by R4 into a D, which again turns into R3, which then produces a C, which via R2 produces again an F. So all the elements are in a way recycled. That is the main idea, and this is a kind of a property that you can check algebraically on the network. So to give you a more intuitive example, that's one of my favorite examples, let's look at the Earth as one very big system. We know it's a thermodynamically open system. Sunlight comes into the system of the Earth. The Earth radiates some heat into space, so there is an input and an output. But in between, everything else is constantly being recycled. That means sunlight is used by plants to absorb CO2 and minerals to grow more plants. Some of these plants die, they produce waste, and the plants also produce O2 oxygen. Now, plants are also eaten by animals. These animals consume oxygen with the result that they produce more animals. They produce also CO2, they produce waste, and they produce heat. Now, the waste, there are decomposers such as bacteria and fungi. They decompose the waste, producing more decomposers, and they release some of the minerals and some of the CO2. So what you see again in this network is that everything being recycled, what is being consumed by some reaction, is being produced again by another reaction, and that's why the ecosystem of the Earth can continue running. It is, as COT calls it, it is self-maintaining and it is closed. It produces all its own components. Here is a little bit more complicated example that I developed also to illustrate this way of thinking. It's an idea of sustainable farm. That means a farm that produces its own material. Now, of course, you also need some inputs. I haven't spoken about sunlight here, but at the very least, the farm expects that there will be water coming into rain. Now, that farm will typically have cows that eat grass and that need water. In return, those cows produce milk and dung. Now, dung left in the grass is eaten by worms who decompose it and produce fertilizer for the grass. Now, we could have a smart farmer would not let these worms go to waste, but would have chickens walking about in the grass, and these chickens would eat the worms. They would produce eggs, and they would turn some of these worms also into fertilizer. Now, I could also feed the chickens with grains. Again, that will produce more chickens and more eggs. The grass will grow on its own. If the grass gets enough water and gets enough fertilizer, it will reproduce. There will be more grass, etc. So that I can see all kinds of interactions that make that the farm produces chickens, eggs, milk, grain, etc. Now, an interesting concept in chemical organization theory is that the organizations form what is called in mathematics a lattice. A lattice is a kind of a partial order in which you can say that one organization is a sub-organization of another organization. Now, the farm model that I described was a farm that had cows, grains, and chickens. So it was producing milk, it was producing grain, it was producing eggs. But when I look at this network of reactions, I can find that if I leave out some of the components, if I, for example, leave out the chickens and the eggs, I could still have a functioning farm. The cows would eat the grass, and there would be grain produced. I could also have another subgroup, a farm that still has chickens but doesn't produce grain, or I could even have a farm where I have only cows and milks. So I have sub-organizations. There is the total farm with all the cows, grains, and chickens. There is a chickenless farms that has grains and cows. There is a grainless farm that has cows and chickens, and then there is the farm that only has cows. Here is an example of how this kind of network would be drawn. That is the minimal farm. That is the one that has only cows, grass, but no chickens and no grains. You see it's already getting complicated. chickens, eggs, and straw and grain here are independent components. No reaction is using them. If I want to put the whole of them, it gets, of course, quite complicated. That's why a typical chemical organization you can't really visualize. It's something you need to analyze mathematically or with a computer. But my colleague Thomas Velos has been developing a computer simulation environment that is quite powerful. These things you can put in hundreds, if not thousands, of different components and different reactions, and you will immediately find which of these subgroups, which of the collections of components and reactions form an organization. So typically, if you have a complex network, you will have a number of sub-organizations. That means particular subsets of components and reactions that together have these properties of what we call closure and self-maintenance. Here's another simple example that I used from a paper that was applying this notion of autopoiesis to kind of give a very simple model of the origin of life, where you would have some kind of an autocatalytic network with molecules A, B, C, and where the C's in this case would have the property of forming a membrane that puts the B's and the A's together and that catalyzes their reactions. So we don't need to look into detail. It's just another example of how you can model these kind of things as self-maintaining reaction networks. So now I come to the interesting point, that is self-organization. I want to see how do complex organizations self-organize. Can I understand how a living organism might self-organize like that? And when I speak about self-organization, I always go back to one of my most inspiring predecessors, the cyberneticist W. Ross Ashby, who formulated what he called the principle of self-organization already in 1947, which is very early because nowadays in complexity theory, it's very well known that you can model self-organization in all kinds of systems, but in 1947, nobody else was really making mathematical models of that. But his principle is very simple. He says, any system that I can look to is a dynamical system. Dynamical systems typically have one or more attractors. He didn't use the term attractor. It wasn't yet common in those days. He called it an equilibrium. An attractor means a place where the system will end up in, and once it's in the attractor, it remains in the attractor. And then he noted, once the system is in the attractor, I still have a system. That means I have something complex with different components that are related to each other, but the attractor by definition is stable. By definition, the attractor will not disappear. Therefore, I can interpret that the different components and processes that are left in that attractor are mutually adapted. So they form a kind of a synergetic whole. The processes are coordinated. Of course, it could be that the attractor is trivial. A dead system is a trivial attractor. You have all the components, you have no processes, nothing happens anymore. So let's now see this concept of a chemical organization, how that can be interpreted as something that self-organizes. So it can be shown mathematically that if you model a reaction network as a dynamical system, which you can do by putting rates on the different reactions, that means you can specify some kind of a dynamic equation that says how quickly, let's say, an A is turned into B. So you could turn it into a full dynamical system, and that dynamical system will have attractors. And now it has been proven mathematically that these attractors necessarily need to be chemical organizations, which kind of makes sense because the chemical organizations are the ones that are self-maintaining. That means the ones that no longer change because they maintain themselves. So how do you self-organize such a chemical organization, you can start with any set of random reactions and components. By definition, a reaction takes some input components that are available, it transforms them into other components. So suppose you start with a few components, a few reactions. These reactions working on the components produce new components. So you add components. That's the first step. As the different reactions are there, you add components. But then, at a certain moment, you will notice that some of the components are consumed by the reactions, but they're not produced or not produced sufficiently. There are methods to calculate whether they can be produced sufficiently or not. So if they're not sufficiently produced, that means that eventually they disappear, they are consumed and not produced. So first you add the new ones, then you remove the ones that are no longer produced, and in the end you only are left with the ones that are both produced and consumed. That means that they remain. Sorry. So that would be a scenario for the self-organization of autopoiesis. Now, of course, the way I describe it, it's so simple, it's so trivial that you can think, well, something like a living cell, like the simplest possible bacterium, could that really happen in such a simple way? Well, yeah, there are a lot of things. You need to have lots of different components and reactions that must be active. So you can follow this scenario the way I just described it, but let's look at an example that's a little bit more complicated than the previous one. This is a randomly generated example. So we had a computer program that would just randomly make combinations of 1, 2, or 3 components and put them in reactions. So you have reactions like, for example, whenever there's an F, that F is turned into an F and a G. Whenever there's a J and an A, it's turned into an H. Whenever there is an E, an I, and a G, it's turned into an E. So let's see whether that thing would self-organize into an organization. So let's start with an initial state, which in this case I have chosen D and H. So I have randomly taken 2 components, D and H. This is my initial state. And then I apply the reactions on the left-hand side. So D and H, there is a reaction on the left that says that whenever you have a D, it's turned into a D and an A. So whenever there is a D and an H, at the very least, the D will produce an A as well. So I get in the next step ADH. Once I get an A, I see that there is a reaction that says that an A can combine with, what was it, with a G. So, I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole steps, but if you apply the reactions, you see that first you are adding components. Up to the long list, you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. Now you have reached what we call closure. That means no more components are added. Once you have reached that state, you can't add any more components. But now you notice that some of these components are being consumed but not being produced again. The H, for example, was there initially, but it is consumed by a reaction that says I plus H gives C plus A. So my H will be consumed, and there is no other reaction that produces an H, so the H will disappear. I go further, and I see that also my D will disappear, because D is again being consumed but not being produced. So in the end, I end up with this list A, B, D, E, F, G, I. I have reached a self-maintaining thing. That means all the components in that list are being produced and consumed, but in such a way that nothing is added, nothing is taken away. So the idea is that you start from an initial state, you let the dynamics of the system as expressed by the reaction act on that state. Sooner or later, you end up in an attractor. That means a region of your state space that the system can enter but cannot leave. But to get to the attractor, you first come from the attractor basin. The basin is the region around the attractor. That means all the states that lead into the attractor. And now that basin is important to understand how realistic this simple model is. Because in the real world, things are not as neat and deterministic as in my simple model. In nature, the environment is variable. That means that the things that were there one moment may not longer be there the other moment, or things that were not there may suddenly appear. So my components that are given, some of them may disappear, some of them may appear. That's what in cybernetics we call a perturbation. The perturbation is some uncontrolled fluctuation in the environment that makes the system deviate from its equilibrium state, in this case from its attractor state. So if we think in terms of a simple living organism like a bacterium, the bacterium still will need an input of food. If the food molecules that it needs disappear, that's a perturbation. Vice versa, some molecule may appear in the environment that interferes with the reactions. That means that it triggers some reaction that maybe destroy fundamental components of that bacterial metabolism. So that's what we would call a toxin. So in order to have an organization that could function as a realistic living system, the system should be able to resist perturbations. Now, the view, the typical representation of dynamical systems is with what we call a phase portrait. That's what I have drawn here. In the dark green, you see the attractor. That's where all the reactions, all the processes lead to. The basin is the light green. That means all the states from which the processes will eventually lead in the attractor. But outside the basin, by definition, you have processes that lead somewhere else, maybe to a different attractor. Anyway, they do not lead to the attractor that you want. So what is now a perturbation? A perturbation, as shown by these interrupted arrows, is something that moves the state from one state to another. Now, there are two types of perturbations in this view. A perturbation like the gray arrows that stays within the basin. Staying within the basin means it moves a state that would have gotten into the attractor to another state that would have gotten into attractor. So basically, nothing much has changed. The outcome will anyway be the attractor. So the system is ending up in its organization, in its autopoietic configuration. But then there are the red arrows. A red arrow is one that takes the system from the state inside the basin to a state outside the basin. And outside the basin, it means it cannot return to its attractor. If that attractor was the autopoietic configuration that was necessary for the system to maintain itself, well, then the red perturbation would mean basically you die, you're outside of your autopoietic attractor. So the big question then is, how likely is it that you get out of your basin? That brings us to the notion of resilience. So a system that can easily survive lots of perturbations is what we call resilient. Resilient means you push it out of its domain of comfort and it gets back on its own. It can survive all kind of unregulated changes, internal and external. That means if a perturbation, for example, would be a toxin that enters the system should somehow have a way to neutralize the toxin. if, for example, the perturbation is that some food molecule that the system was using has disappeared, it should be able to switch to a different type of food that maybe is still present. So compensating perturbation means being able to return to your self-maintaining regime. But being able to return to your self-maintaining regime in a wide range of perturbations means that you need to have a wide basin of attraction. Or what's a term that's sometimes used in autopoiesis theory is the domain of viability. The domain wherein the system remains viable, that means able to survive, should be pretty wide so that it doesn't get killed too quickly. Now, in the theory of resilience, there's an interesting approach using dynamical systems theory, which distinguishes three different aspects of resilience. One is called the latitude, which you might say is the width of the basin of attraction. You would like the basin of attraction to be as wide as possible so that it can compensate a wide variety of perturbations. There's a second aspect that is called resistance, which intuitively we might see as the depth of the basin of attraction. That's kind of the idea that you need a lot of energy to push the system outside of its basin of attraction. And then there is something called precariousness. Well, maybe you have a very wide and deep basin of attraction, but if you are close to the border of that basin, then maybe a single perturbation that is just the one pointing towards the border of the basin may be enough to push you out and to kill you. So we can see that more clearly on this picture. So if we imagine the basin of attraction as a kind of a valley, and at the bottom is the attractor, then the latitude is how wide it is, the resistance is how deep it is, and the precariousness is how close are you to the border where if you're pushed across the border, you lose your self-maintenance. Here is a similar picture in 3D. So now I come to our interpretation of goal-directedness. So when do we speak about a goal-directed system? We speak about the system being goal-directed when it, in a wide variety of cases, always goes back to a particular state that we call the goal. So you perturb it, you push it, you make it deviating, but it always goes back to the same goal. That's when you know that the system is goal-directed. So in order to model such a goal, the goal should be an attractor for the system considered as a dynamical system. That attractor should have a wide enough basin so that you can push it pretty hard and in many different directions without it getting out of its basin. And we also assume that a goal is not an equilibrium. And by equilibrium, I here mean a thermodynamic equilibrium, which means a dead state. A dead state is an equilibrium. Nothing happens in a dead state. That's not what you want. You want to have a goal state, an attractor state where the system remains active, where the processes are going on, where the production and consumption processes of the metabolism are active. So operationally, how can you see that the system is goal-directed? If it's not yet in the goal, it will move towards the goal. If it is in the goal, it will stay there. If it is perturbed and pushed away from its goal, it will perform some action and it will mobilize energy to return to its goal. So that's what you expect from a goal-directed system. That's what you expect from an autopoietic system, because autopoiesis implicitly means the goal is to maintain yourself, to survive. So now we need to understand how such resilient systems could have evolved. And now we're starting to reason in terms of evolution to variation selection. Now imagine a kind of a primitive soup where all kind of different molecules are interacting with each other and they form all kind of temporary organizations. There will be a lot of random changes in there. The environment is constantly changing. So generally speaking, whichever organizations are there, we will not expect them to be very strong, to be very stable. So most likely they will destroy the organization, but destroying the organization typically means setting up the stage to change into a different organization. So now what is the role of natural selection? We can expect that under the influence of that variation, all these random components and reactions appearing or disappearing, eventually all the ones that are fragile, that means all the ones that are easily disturbed, that cannot easily recover, will disappear, and the ones that are resilient are the ones that survive. So we can understand how through natural selection, even the organizations initially are very simple and fragile will become better and better at coping with perturbations. Now I'm coming almost to the end of my story. Now we still need to add the notion of cognition. So Maturana and Varela, in the description of autopoiesis, they say that autopoietic systems, that means living systems, are by definition cognitive. That means they have some degree of knowledge or intelligence. Why is that? If you think in terms of goal-directed activity, that means you need to perform the right action at the right moment. The right moment, that means you need to know what is precisely the situation, what is the condition, what kind of components are present or absent. You need to be able to sense what your condition is. You need to be able to perform an action to counter the perturbation. For example, if a toxin enters the system should be able to produce something that neutralizes the toxin. And implicit in that is that the system should produce the right counteraction. It should not try to neutralize a toxin of one type with a detoxifier of a different type. It needs to know somehow what to do. So implicit in the notion of a resilient autopoietic system is that the rules of the system and have some kind of a knowledge. Now, this knowledge, we can model that very simply with a concept from artificial intelligence, what is called a condition action rule. Condition action rule has the form: if some condition X is present, that means the system senses that X is the case, then it performs some action Y, which is equivalent to a process or a reaction. If X, then Y. X is turned into Y. Now, how can we implement that knowledge in a reaction network? Well, a condition action rule is really that something in the system makes sure that whenever there's a perturbation, the right action is produced to neutralize that perturbation. So let's assume that some toxin enters the system, and the system has some inbuilt molecule, a catalyst, that neutralizes the toxin. So the toxin in contact with the catalyst will be turned into a waste product, and the waste product is then evacuated. So these catalysts would embody the knowledge of the system. Now, where do we find this in living systems? Well, living systems keep their information, their knowledge in their genome, that means in their DNA. So we can interpret DNA as a collection of condition action rules. So how does that work? DNA will be activated by the metabolism. That means if some molecule enters the cell, that may set in motion a process that reads a particular part of the DNA, a particular gene. The gene codes for a particular enzyme, and that enzyme deals with the molecule. So that is basically how living cells function. Enzymes are produced when they need to in order to deal with particular molecules that enter the cell. If they're not needed, well, the enzymes are not produced. The DNA, on the other hand, remains invariant. It's kind of a memory, a storage, a library of procedures that tells the cell how to produce the right enzymes. So, where does that knowledge come from? Well, by evolution, of course. That autopoietic system can acquire knowledge either by mutation or by the equivalent of sexual recombination. And with bacteria, we know, for example, there's a very simple mechanism of acquiring knowledge. That is that a bacteria can exchange DNA in the form of a so-called plasmid. A plasmid is a little thing of DNA which bacteria sometimes excrete, they drop it in their environment, and then other bacteria can ingest that plasmid. And now, why is that useful? Because sometimes the plasmid contains the DNA for exactly the kind of thing you need. So suppose that a bacterium is subjected to an antibiotic. An antibiotic is a toxin, it's a perturbation, it's something that may kill the bacterium if it doesn't know how to neutralize it. But suppose that some other bacteria have developed immunity resistance against that antibiotic. Why have they developed resistance? Because to some mutation in their DNA, they have developed a gene for a particular enzyme that can neutralize the antibiotic. Now, if that bit of DNA that codes for neutralizing of antibiotic is exchanged, other bacteria can take it up and they can learn new condition action rules. So finally, I come to a kind of a simple model of how could life have emerged in 3 steps. First, I need a reaction network, a self-maintaining reaction network, what we call the chemical organization. Models of the origin of life will typically speak about autocatalytic sets, but a chemical organization is actually more general than an autocatalytic set. The originator of chemical organization theory, Peter Dietrich, has collaborated with some of the scientists that are the proponents of this autocatalytic set theory of the origin of life, and they've come to the conclusion that, well, actually, the autocatalytic set are a type of chemical organization, which means that chemical organizations are more general, which means they are actually easier to self-organize. So initially, you have this kind of self-maintaining reaction network. Then at a certain moment, you develop knowledge on how to deal with reactions that do not always need to be there. The typical chemical organizations, all the reactions are active. A catalyzed reaction network means that you need some catalyst. That means components that are not transformed by the reaction. So they're kind of passively waiting until something triggers them, and then they can, for example, turn that something into something else. So the catalyst or the enzymes, they act as agents that can switch reactions on and off depending on when they are needed. So your system becomes already more adaptive. And then finally, you will have the full model where you also have the genome. That means that you have a kind of a fixed memory, the DNA, where the enzymes can be produced or not produced depending on when they are needed. So with these 3 levels, in principle, you can build a pretty complex and adaptive autopoietic system. So in conclusion, what I have tried to show is that autopoietic systems can self-organize. The basic mechanism is extremely simple. You have a network of reactions. This network of reactions goes into an attractor That means a configuration that is closed and self-maintaining. But most of these attackers are very fragile. That means, yeah, it's not that easy to evolve a life that can survive in changing circumstances. But given enough time, as we had in the beginning of the origin of life, you can expect that these organizations evolve to become increasingly resilient. That means able to deal with increasingly more perturbations by acquiring the equivalent of condition action rules. That means knowledge on how to deal with each type of perturbation. And as a result, we get a system that we can call goal-directed. That means it will move towards its attractor of self-production, autopoiesis, no matter what are the perturbations. So that was my talk. If there are still any questions.
Professor Heylighen, thank you for your talk. I was actually wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on resilience, because, if you think about dissipative systems, I'm kind of wondering how what you've explained kind of deals with transience, like transience of phenomena.
Mhm. Well, the resilience, it's what I don't know the latest details, but my colleague Thomas Velos has been making these dynamical system models, simulations, where uh, first you generate a random network, then you find the organizations in that network, and then you start throwing perturbations at the organization. So there are different types of perturbations. You can have what I call qualitative perturbation. You introduce a new component. There can also be quantitative perturbation. That means you slow down or you speed up certain reactions, or you increase the concentration of certain components, or you decrease it. And then you can see how well they react. And yeah, typically what you see is if you throw enough perturbations at them, they will eventually tend to get into a regime where they are pretty resilient. But what he found actually, which was not in our original hypothesis, is that what typically happens is that there isn't one organization, but it's rather a family of organizations that are mostly the same. They have mostly the same components, but sometimes you can be turned from the one into the other, which means you lose one component, so you replace it with another component. So that's where these transients and these intermediate stages appear, but uh, it's pretty difficult to analyze exactly how that happens, because I mean, if you want to make it non-trivial, you immediately have hundreds of components and reactions, and then it becomes difficult to analyze exactly where the weak spots are and where the strengths are.
I see. I remember Philip Anderson, he kind of objected to dissipative systems in general, just from the point of view of like boundary conditions. And
Mhm.
so that's why I was wondering. But yeah, thank you. If are there any other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering if there's any other areas, like I know with cyberneticists, they looked at like economics and political theory a bit. I was wondering if you think there's any other areas where like this sort of theory could apply to that's not being looked at as much.
Yeah. It's as I said, it is in principle applicable to anything that kind of self-organizes out of processes. Economics, for example, business ecosystems is one of the things we would like to model. We have had one PhD that was starting to do something a little bit in that direction. I know that now Thomas is also working with this guy who made his PhD on modeling wars, where there are also different factions. I don't know the details that can be modeled in this way. Ecosystems, where you have different species that where the one eats the other or the one helps the other. So there are quite a lot of applications. Sustainability, like this example I gave about the farm. You could try to find under which conditions will the farm be self-sustaining. You can do a lot of modeling with it. It's a very powerful formalism, but not many people have been using it yet, so that's why I'm hoping that I may have inspired some people to look into this formalism and use it to start modeling these kind of things.
Thank you.
Right.
Oh,
Uh,
yes.
yeah, go ahead.
I have a question that um I sort of think of memory often as kind of in a bit of Hopfieldian sense, where it kind of stores uh, from external random field in like a frustrated system, and this is like there's like a metastable attractor, but what's interesting to me is how would you distinguish between um, the merely like retention of certain memory versus actual goal where you act externally? I don't know if my question really makes sense, but I hope it does.
Well, the kind of memory you're speaking about, which is the neural memory, is not the kind of memory I have been speaking about. I've been speaking about at this moment at a discrete, stable memory like DNA. Either you have the gene or you don't have it. Of course, neural networks is also a very interesting application, but well, I have started working myself on applying this kind of reasoning to modeling neural networks, but I'm really too early in that to tell you anything without creating more confusion, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I was more asking about kind of if we think about how would this connect to, uh, for example, like reinforcement learning and formation of um, instrumental goals there. Um, for example,
Well,
like survivalism.
reinforcement learning can, in principle, be modeled if you take into account the quantitative version of the formalism. So, in the qualitative version of the formalism, either you have the catalyst that performs a particular condition action rules or you don't have it. But if you look at it quantitatively, you can have more or less of it. That means if you model the reactions as having a particular rate in which they produce certain outcomes, you could increase or decrease that rate by, for example, producing more or less of a catalyst that controls the rate of that reaction. So in principle, learning or reinforcement could be if a particular reaction somehow produces the good thing, brings you closer to your goal, then you would want to increase the concentration of the catalyst that activates that reaction. So in principle, you could do that, but how to implement reinforcement learning in in the sense that the system would know when to increase the catalyst. I don't have a ready-made answer for that yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, if there aren't any goals, we'll stop here. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.